Alofa to it's Tim Tafunga here. It's the 7th of October, and I'm just responding to some live streaming chats I've had with the New Zealand Parliament. I've been chatting with a lot of Kiwis who feel very strong about the Israeli alleged genocide, and I had posited the notion that the whole idea of genocide as a narrative is actually a default Nazi narrative that was used initially in recent years by the Ukrainian Stepan Bandera Nazis in order to claim that the Russians were committing genocide against the Ukrainians within the Donbass region in the initial weeks and months of the special military operation by the Russian forces. And the Ukrainian government had submitted a claim to the International Criminal Court subsequently, and that was quickly overwhelmed by the kidnapping children and the subsequent the arrest warrant by the ICC against President Putin, which is still pending, but it was ignored by the Russian authorities subsequently. This is prior to the Russian general elections that about 70% of Russians voted for President Putin. So there was an overwhelming endorsement of President Putin and not an approval of the ICC arrest warrant. Now, obviously, New Zealand and a lot of Kiwis would beg to differ about Nazis making allegations of genocide against the Ukrainians, with regarding to the Palestinian case, in which the pan-Arab nationalists who worked in cahoots with the European Nazis in using the same narrative of genocide against the Palestinians. Now, in the Palestinian case, the very first week of the Israeli attack on the Hamas within Gaza had resulted in 2,200 casualties, which was immediately reported to the ICC by the Palestinian government authorities, allegedly as ethnic genocide by the Israeli government. Now, that's a default by Nazis. Now, Nazis would use the narrative of genocide for the Ukrainians, and they would use the same argument for the Palestinian case. Now, the genocide claims that was actually heard in the ICC was relatively subsumed to the claims of the allegations of child abduction by President Putin. Now, that's almost like an Epstein-type abduction of Ukrainian children in a ICC child trafficking claims of criminality and culpability by the Russian government. Of course, it's a lot of rubbish. These were orphans from the Donbass regions who were predominantly Russian-speaking children, who were orphaned by the civil war within the Lugansk People's Republic and the Donetsk People's Republic oblasts, the Donetsk Oblast, 8 years up to the special military operation, in which subsequently led to the relocation of Ukrainian, well, considered Ukrainian, but were Donbass Russian children that were repatriated to Russia. Subsequent to this, the allegations made by the Ukrainian government to the ICC was that President Putin had abducted children. Now, you would think that the claims of genocide would be superseded by the mass deaths, and even more important for the global attention would be the MH17 shootdown, allegedly by President Putin's government, would have taken precedence over the child abduction, but no, it didn't. So instead, what you have was the Banderites at the Sloboda political party, the Ukrainians' right sector, and Azov battalion Nazis cohesively worked together in order to pass on the narrative of child abduction when they realized that the genocide narrative wasn't that convincing. Instead, the genocide narrative has now been accepted by the G77 lobby group within the United Nations, who had subsequently pushed for the recognition of the Palestinian state, supported by Europeans, in particular by Germany, France, and Great Britain, and countries, and also subsequently by Australia and New Zealand. What you have is a consolidation of the ultra-nationalist narrative, which was the Nazi narrative. Now, the claims of genocide is a default from the Nazis who were guilty for the Holocaust and the genocide against the Jews, with 6 million deaths. The child abduction, like the Palestinian abduction of and taking of Israeli hostages, is similar in that narrative of hostage taking. Now, we've had the Gaza flotilla, which were purportedly carrying humanitarian aid to Gaza, but subsequently were intercepted by the Israeli Defense Force. When the Israeli Defense Force commandeered the vessels, they went through all the cargo holds to see whether there were any humanitarian aids. They discovered there were no humanitarian aids, none whatsoever, which means it was purely a propaganda flotilla. So, what does that remind us? It reminds us that 2 years earlier, in 2023, the Al-Aqsa flood operation conducted by the Hamas had coincided with the Yom Kippur celebrations of the Jews. Now, in October, the propaganda flotilla from Turkey also coincided with Yom Kippur for the Jews in 2025. Now, simultaneously, in Manchester City, a Syrian terrorist attacked a Jewish synagogue in Manchester City. At the same time, the Gaza flotilla was intercepted by the Israelis. And what was the first default claims made by Greta Thunberg and all of the New Zealanders and Australians, hostages? They claimed to be hostages by the Israeli forces. Already, they had pre-prepared their default narrative. The narrative was always going to be, they are hostages by the Jews. Now that is reverse psychology, and again it is increasing the big lie narrative of the Jews committing genocide and taking hostages. So what we have here is a psychological warfare that is being supported by an overwhelming lobby group, the G77 within the United Nations, supported by Europeans, the ultra-conservatives and nationalist Europeans, the same people who are revising the Nazi narrative with the attack on the Russians and the Operation Unthinkable that was entertained by Winston Churchill, who thought about conducting an operation against the communists using the Iron Wall, the Iron Curtain narrative to undermine the Stalinist regime. Now, Operation Unthinkable was the brainchild and the brainstorm of Winston Churchill. Now, that was a peacetime operation that mirrored the military operation of Adolf Hitler, which was Operation Barbarossa. Now, when you do the peacetime operation, which would lead to NATO being formed in 1949, the initial commanders of NATO were former Nazi commanders and would include former participants within Operation Barbarossa. Now, interestingly, Stepan Bandera was considered a consultant to the Germans and the commanders of the new German military that replaced the Wehrmacht. So when they became participants of NATO and were commanders of NATO, removing their Nazi uniforms, they became NATO commanders. Now, Stepan Bandera was also a consultant to NATO. Already you could see up to the day when he was finally assassinated by a FSB agent, or at that time was a KGB agent. He was eliminated in 1956. 2 years after Nikita Khrushchev had assumed the role as the president of Russia, whose father was a Ukrainian and whom had worked in the Donetsk Oblast for a number of years up until the Stalin regime, and during the World War II when he became a commander in the Stalinist Soviet army. But the thing about Nikita Khrushchev was that he was pro-Ukrainian. He was born in Kursk, and he subsequently gave Ukraine Crimea, which was, at the time, after the death of Joseph Stalin, illegal. But he did it. He handed over Crimea and subsequently the Black Sea Fleet port of Sevastopol to the Ukrainians from 1954 onwards, up until 1991 when Ukraine became independent. The Sevastopol was given to the Ukrainian Navy that only had a aircraft carrier that couldn't work, but they sold it to the Chinese, and the Chinese turned it into the Liaoning type 001 aircraft carrier. But the inroads made by the selling of the type 001 Liaoning to the Chinese gave birth to the current Chinese Blue Water Fleet. But you know, these are some of these things that came out of other things. But that's a digression for another topic entirely. But on the point of the influence of the Ukrainians, Nazis, is indeed the rekindling of Operation Barbarossa and Winston Churchill's Operation Unthinkable. Now, the unthinkable did come true with the Euromaidan in 2014, with the overthrow of the legitimate, democratically elected Yanukovych government, replaced by eventually the Poroshenko Ukrainian government, which stirred the Donbass region that started the civil war after the failure of the referenda to secede from Ukraine by the Donetsk People's Republic initially, and then subsequently by the Lugansk People's Republic. Now, there's been a civil war since 2014, up until the special military operations of 2022. Now, on September 27th, 2022, there was a referenda, and subsequent to that referenda was the ratification of the 5 former Ukrainian oblasts into the Russian Federation. When that happened on October the 3rd, 2022, the war was over. But no, it wasn't over. Instead, NATO encouraged Ukraine to be emboldened and to continue the Russo-Ukrainian War from October 3rd, 2022, long after the ratification within the Russian Duma of the 5 additional Russian Federation oblasts into the Russian Federation. That in itself is the end game. That's the game of chess where the king has been captured by the Russians. Now, in 2025, the Ukrainians and NATO are still moving the chess pieces long after the king has been captured on October the 3rd, 2022. In the meantime, on October the 7th, 2023, a distraction occurred with another group of pan-Arab nationalists known as the Hamas, who were colluding with the Syrian ISIS fighters who were training in Turkey with ISIS-K, who went to Crocus City Hall and attacked the Russians in Moscow and killing 150 people in the Crocus City Hall who came from Turkey. Now, ISIS-K, which is Khorasan, the ISIS fighters were ex-prisoners from Khorasan and various areas who were enticed and paid for by Burisma from Ukraine to attack Russia, training in a CIA black site in Turkey, who went to Russia to kill Russians. Fast forward to Hamas. Hamas themselves were Syrian ISIS fighters as well, who were mobilized into Gaza to attack the Israelis. Again, the ISIS fighters, who are, a lot of them were from Idlib in North Syria, which is the current Syrian rebel army, who overthrew the Assad regime in January 2025, causing Assad from the Shia-backed Alawite forces to leave Syria to Russia. In the meantime, Hamas attacked the Jews in 2023, sparking a war between Israel and Gaza and the Houthis and Iran. We have this cascading effect, this rippling effect of the pan-Arab Nazis, the Ukrainian Nazis, and the present Palestinian conflict we have today. Everything revolves back to square one. Now, what's the subsequent outcome of this war? We may have a redux of the Crimean War of the last Crusades by those Byzantium Russians who wanted to capture Constantinople to liberate the Byzantine headquarters of Constantinople from the Ottomans. That happened in 1853, the British and the French joined forces with the Ottomans to fight against the Russians in the Crimean War of 1853, in which the Russians lost. But you've got to remember, that's where we have the story of the charge of the Light Brigade, with Lord Alfred Tennyson's charge of the Light Brigade, where the British had attacked the Russians' artillery. Not the Ukrainian artillery, the Russian artillery. Now, when we refer to the 1853 Crimean War, that was a war against the Ottomans by the Russians, because Russia wanted to get rid of the Ottoman Turks from Turkey. But what happened? We had World War I, when the Ottomans were finally defeated by the Allies, including the Russians. This time, the British and the French were fighting with the Russians against the Ottomans. So if you understand your history, you know how Palestine was liberated. In 1917, with the Balfour Declaration, creating a Palestinian state for Jews. Arthur Balfour created the Palestinian state in the occupied enemy territories, OET, in Palestine as a homeland for the Jews. Not Arabs, not Muslims, Judaist Jews. That was 1917. But we had the Holocaust in the 1930s. In 1942, Adolf Hitler sat down and spoke to Amin al-Husseini, the leader, the Imam of the Al-Aqsa Mosque. And when that happened, they had a discussion regarding the final solution, in which the Palestinian cleric encouraged Adolf Hitler for the extermination of the Jews. Hence, the Holocaust. Palestine directly encouraged Adolf Hitler to exterminate the Jews, the genocide. Now, in 2022, 2023, now it's 2025, it's gone full circle. Now the Nazis are calling the Jews guilty of the Holocaust. And I'll leave it at that.
They flat out rejected it. And now we know why, because it was never about bringing aid to Gazans, but it was all about the headlines and the social media followings. I'm sure you guys can guess where I am, because it's pretty much an empty room. That's right, I'm inside one of the vessels, one of the largest vessels to come in this Yom Kippur flotilla. And while we're processing this boat, there's one thing missing, guys. All this aid that they were supposed to bring into Gaza, which explains one thing to me, I'm sure it explains to you, that when we and multiple other countries offered them to take this aid and bring it to the Gazans, we could facilitate its safe arrival, they flat out rejected it. And now we know why, because it was never about bringing aid to Gazans, but it was all about the headlines and the social media followings.